Hello, I'm Todd Phillips, the editor of Canadian Auto Dealer. We're joined today by Amy Karam. Amy is an author and a speaker and advisor to governments and businesses who they seek her advice on strategies around global trade dynamics and innovation, and she'll be participating in the 2026 CADA Summit. Amy, thanks for joining us.
Hey, happy to be here. Thanks for having me.
Well, we couldn't arrive at a better time for somebody who really understands global trade and politics, given everything that's going on in the world today. And I've interviewed a few of our keynotes and speakers, and I always start with sort of the same question this year to them. Have you ever seen anything like this before? Are we in fairly uncharted waters with what's going on in the global trade environment?
Yeah, it's a good question. I would say yes and no. I think we've seen trickles of this before. This isn't this being, the tariffs and the trade wars, et cetera. I think we've seen bits of this before over the last decade. I think it's just been super amplified since President Trump has come into office. But, and, uh, if we look back, we did get clues about what could happen or what has now happened with Trump 1.0. That he was a tough bargainer back then. When you remember, if you remember with Kuzma, negotiating Kuzma, that was not easy. And the tariff talks started back then. And also, if we were to take this in a global perspective, we saw some of this kind of trade behavior with China over the last decade. And in fact, I'm also not surprised because that's why I wrote The China Factor. And in fact, that came out almost 10 years ago, 2016 in the spring. My point is, these kind of dynamics happen over time. It's not just an overnight trickle, but we need to pay attention. And that's when I started observing when Huawei was rising out of China. This was 20 years ago when I was working at Cisco in Silicon Valley, and I realized that they had a different trade dynamic. And so you notice, in the last 5+ years, 5G, right? The whole explosion with 5G and national security and economic security. That was just yet another example of the things that we're experiencing today in the automotive industry and farming and commodities, et cetera. So it's being repeated. We just need to watch the trends and anticipate them better so that we're not so shocked.
Okay, we'll get to China again in a moment, but I really want to zone in a little bit on the auto industry now. The summit
Sure.
is an auto dealer audience, and autos seem to be right in the middle, smack in the middle of all these global trade disputes. What's the impact been of all these disruptions of tariffs and counter tariffs on the auto industry in particular?
Yeah, huge, as we're seeing, right? Huge from a manufacturing perspective, importing, tariffs, exporting. Uh, it was a very comfortable dynamic that we had. And because we could depend on the USA, and just even trading parts back and forth, let alone the finished goods, and now that's imploded. But let's take a look at why it's happening. And I think what's happening is the USA is feeling very threatened, right? Globally. And they're no longer so they're trying to pull back some of the core functions, whether it's manufacturing, whether it's supply chain management, because a lot of Western countries have been dependent on um, other nations, especially from the East, for their supply chains. And so what this reckoning is about is how can we Canada or other Western nations start increasing their contributions to the value chain, right? How can we start um, having more um, ownership, let's say, or um, control over the supply pieces. And then as you move up the value chain, how can you differentiate your center of expertise? And these are the kind of dynamics that I think we're looking at. And then it comes down to industrial policy. What are we good at? What is the strategy for Canada? What is America's now strategy going forward? So as these dynamics shift, we as different nations are all trying to realign ourselves in terms of, okay, what does it look like for us in the next 10 years? How are we going to be special or different or differentiated in the automotive sector so that we aren't so punished when these trade dynamics happen?
Well, we've talked a lot about the US. I'd like to ask you, because you talk about global trade dynamics, we're having a spat with our closest friend. Doesn't mean there
Yes.
aren't other friends out there that we should really be forging relationships with. So what can Canada do? What other countries should we be looking to really deepen our export, our industrial policy, and certainly in the area of automotive? Where else can we look for more friends, let's say, so we're not the only ones dancing with the US?
Great question. And I guess it would also depend on what are we looking to do, right? Like so, immediately it comes Europe. Obviously, let's strengthen ties with Europe and Southeast Asia because they have some of the economies of scale that we could benefit from, and vice versa. And then there's also nations that have the intellectual property or the intellectual capital that maybe will help Canada move into new business models. I think there's an opportunity for us to differentiate, maybe from a services perspective, or what I call establishing a co-opetition model whereby we can create one specialized contribution to an entire vehicle or another country's process. So it's a matter of taking inventory to see who is where in the ecosystem in terms of success and market penetration. It might be too late for Canada to catch up and actually create an EV that will penetrate um, critical mass globally. And if that is the case, then what can we contribute to this new, an emerging um, industry or sector of the industry that would allow us to be a differentiated contributor so that we aren't always competing, but we're collaboratively competing. We compete in our own little niche and we ride the tail of other contributors.
Great answer. Hey, one question I have for you really is around China. You've written a book on China. You know a lot about the dynamics of doing business with China. I know a lot of Canadian auto dealers are now going as part of the CADA, the Dealer Association, to fact-finding missions to China. And certainly every other market in the world except Canada and the US pretty much have Chinese-made OEMs selling within their borders. Not yet the case in Canada, but as Canada looks to maybe open that up, as we're looking for, other partners, what do we need to consider as business people and business leaders in those dealings, in those interactions with the new Chinese business partners that may well be arriving on our shores? What would you advise our dealers to be wary of and aware of, let's say?
Yeah, another great question. Know what your Chinese partner's interests are. Why do they want to do business with you? Why do they want to do business with Canada? What is their bigger strategy? So, for example, in the EV market, Canada and the US, I think, are the last two countries where they haven't exported to. Is this just to check off the boxes, for example? Or is there a bigger strategy involved? So it's a matter of don't take the agreements or the engagements at face value. Do some digging. The other thing that you should be wary of is umbrella companies. So when sometimes it's not so obvious that this is a Chinese-owned company, they might say it's American or Canadian or European. There's layers. There are layers of ownership. If that's important to you, if you think it might impact the way you do business with them, know what that organizational structure is. Also, know that deals are flexible. We write a contract and we think it's legally binding and that's it, and you are committed to me for 5 years. Some other cultures, like the Chinese culture, like some East Asian cultures, there's more fluidity, right? Agreements or contracts are revisited. There's a lot of gray zone. Know that there are those possibilities. Don't be comfortable just with what you talk about, what you agree on, and have contingencies. What's your backup plan? And don't put all your eggs in one basket. And if you really are wanting to do business with them, have somebody on the ground over there who can also just be your eyes and ears to find out what's going on, whether it's the with the government relations, the company relations. Things are rapidly moving all the time. Uh, Private sector or industry is very connected to government, and that's a really important understanding that each collaborator must have.
Well, that's a good point to end because, we want the dealers to attend the summit and hear some of your observations firsthand. Certainly, there's interest in a lot of the topics we just hit on, but certainly relations with the Chinese OEMs. It seems to be a case of, not if anymore, but when in terms of, the timeline no one's sure of, but it looks like, it's unlikely Canada and US will be the only markets on the planet not doing business with the Chinese OEM. So we'll have more to say at the summit. I appreciate your time today and look forward to meeting you at the summit.
Likewise, thanks, Todd.